What's going on, guys? I'm Tyler, and I'm here to let you know that The Black Phone is no perfect movie. And it centers on a boy named Finney, played by Mason Thames, who in 1978 is abducted by a serial killer known only as the Grabber, played by Ethan Hawke. And in the soundproof basement that he's trapped in, there's a disconnected phone that Finney can use to contact the killer's previous victims, who can hopefully give him clues on how to escape. All the while, without giving anything away, his younger sister Gwen, played by Madeleine McGraw, starts to receive clues of her own that can help rescue her brother and leads her to conduct her own investigation. Now, when I heard about this movie, I saw the poster for this back in December. Every time a trailer popped up on my YouTube feed, you could hear Ethan Hawke go, "Want to see a magic trick?" And I cut away within an instant. I knew that with Scott Derrickson and Ethan Hawke teaming up again after Sinister, I'd have to go into this as blindly as I possibly could, and I am so fucking glad I did that. This is one of the creepiest movies I've seen in a very long time. And it felt a lot different from other Blumhouse horror movies I've seen in that it's one that relies on its chilling atmosphere the most in order to scare us, as opposed to jolting us with cheap jump scares. And it's one where it felt like the writing, the direction, and the performances were what equally made things utterly terrifying. The fact that these characters were so well fleshed out in a short amount of time, you were actually scared for Mason Thames' life. You were scared of what Ethan Hawke could possibly do to him. But you're never given too much information or too little on what's going on with these characters or the situation. Just enough where you can get a general grasp of what these characters are like, what their life goals are, and how it correlates to the story, and the rest you can interpret all for yourself. Mason Thames was absolutely terrific as Finney, which I wasn't expecting because during the first 20 minutes or so, he and Madeleine McGraw as brother and sister started off a little rocky. Their timing and line delivery, for lack of a better term, felt a little phoned in. I swear I didn't come up with that. That's just what I wrote down in my notes. Bear with me on that. But over time, they became progressively more natural. Thames in particular has to carry quite a few scenes without any dialogue whatsoever as he's acting out the clues that these other kids are trying to pass on to him. Some of the best scenes are him silently using whatever he can in the basement, whether it be carpet or a random tool that was kept with him before he was abducted. And it was so refreshing to see a kid in a horror movie, mind you, act so smart even when the plan doesn't work out the way you'd want it to. He's so ingenious. You know for a fact that he's capable of escaping, but whenever a plan doesn't work because he did something that the other kids warned him not to do, or he chickens out at the last minute because he's afraid of something going wrong, the movie wisely calls him out for it. You never roll your eyes and look at him and say, "What a fucking idiot," because the movie calls him out and shames him in as polite a way as possible for not standing up. And that actually does correlate to his arc very nicely from the first 20 minutes of the film, where we mainly see what his home life and his school life is like. He has to deal with an alcoholic, abusive father. He gets the shit kicked out of him at school. And I gotta say, the school fights in this movie are surprisingly just as bloody as the serial killer plotline. My folks grew up in the 70s, and I'm willing to bet if I were to ask them, "Hey, is this what this was like?" they probably would say no. But you can see in his eyes, through his facial expressions and body language, whenever he has to react to the abuse or bullying. You can tell that Finney has learned the hard way to treat others the way that you would want to be treated. The abuse hasn't made him a bitter kid. If anything, it's made him emotionally stronger to a certain degree, and that makes him instantly sympathetic and supposedly mature beyond his years. But whenever there's an opportunity for him to shout at people to make them stop or to physically get involved himself, he never stands up for himself. And he doesn't stand up for himself because he's seen so many times his younger sister try to rebel against her father, against the bullies, and it failing tremendously. Or he's seen what happens when other people who stand up for themselves become the physical brutes. There's this one great scene where during a school fight, the bully is the one who gets knocked down and gets pummeled to near death, or at least it looks near death with the amount of blood coming out of his nose. And while his sister, the one who rebels, is constantly cheering it on, he is so horrified and wants to completely walk away. You get the sense that he's afraid if he does get physical, he's going to become just as bad as the people who have wronged him. And you can definitely understand that motivation. I love it when a movie or show actually takes time to explore and understand why abuse victims are so scared of coming forward, while also reminding us and reminding anyone watching who may be in the same situation that coming forward, making it very clear that you were under attack, is the only way that you are going to get help. And seeing Finn attempt to become a stronger, braver, and more outspoken person led to some of the most emotionally heartfelt moments that I've seen in any movie this year, particularly one where he gets a phone call from the one victim who he was actually friends with and gives him some simple but still identifiable and important motivation that was so endearing. I actually thought I was going to start crying, but needless to say, you probably would start crying if you were stuck in a basement with Ethan Hawke, who was downright fucking terrifying as the grabber. During the finale, every time Finn was in danger, I was breathing so hard, I was shaking, I was breathing so fast, hyperventilating. It felt like I was having a panic attack. And I knew for a fact that I wasn't, just because real life experience, unfortunately. But that, oh my god, it was like a roller coaster ride. That's never happened to me before. And in a strange way, I'm actually glad that a movie can bring those kind of emotions into my head. I love that for the majority of the film, you never see the grabber's face in full. Even when he's out in public trying to lurk out prey, he has a hat or a pair of sunglasses on him in order to make him considerably more ominous. And in any other scene, you see these ever-changing masks on his face, where at one point it covers his entire face but it has no mouth, and then in the next scene it has a mouth but only covers the second half of his face. It offers a lot of subtle clues as to what kind of a psychopath he is, whether or not he has a split personality, whether he views this as his face entirely. And I know with that in mind, there are some people who are going to complain anyone could put a mask on and it would look creepy. And sometimes that is true, but in my opinion, Ethan Hawke is one of the very few actors who can take a face mask and make it seem as if it is changing emotion or is actually their legitimate face. And he was so convincing that sometimes it did feel like the mask actually was his skin, with the facial expressions and the body language that he conveys with the differing emotions of the grabber. Whenever the grabber is approaching Finney and he has total control over the situation, he has this stilted and slow body posture where he ever so slowly creeps his, turns his head forward and his eyebrows just raise in such a childish and giddy fashion, or his eyes will be completely covered in shadow. And it just, it sends you shivers, because you know for a fact he's the one who's in charge and he is loving every single second of it. Even in his line delivery, he's a lot more calm and childishly high-pitched to let us know that he's enjoying every second of it. And he only talks in a lower pitch and talks faster when he's actually about to lash out at Finney, which isn't very often. He's surprisingly a lot creepier when he's calm and in control, because while we can see through his body language that we know for a fact what he's feeling in the moment, since we technically can't see his face, we're still left in suspense wondering if and when he's actually going to snap, what he actually has in store for Finney. And that's the thing that had my stomach churning the entire time. His motivation and his backstory is left a complete mystery. You have no idea whether he's targeting specific boys or if he's looking to pick any boy off the street, if it reminds him of something and he has some pathetic excuse to continue torturing them. There are so many clues where you can interpret your own motivation as to what kind of a serial killer he is. And if I were to guess his overall motivation, I would say that probably like Vinny, he was an abused child, but he's the case where he became more bitter and envious of other kids for supposedly having a better life and getting more attention than he does. So if he kidnaps, tortures, and kills them, he'll be able to exact his revenge on society and become noticed, become popular, because when the victims make the papers, so does he, because he's the one who's responsible for it. And with Madeleine McGraw as Gwen, a lot of reviews have called her the breakout star of the film because of how unique she is in terms of the tone of the movie, or really with any horror movie recently. And while I'd agree with that, I don't know that she's in the movie enough to make that big of an impact, and I'll get into that later, but at the same time, she was the biggest surprise performance-wise for me in this movie. She had perfectly believable chemistry with Mason Thames as siblings. Her arc was similar to her brother in that she had to face her fears in order to get the help that the two of them desperately need. But what stood out was that she's the comic relief of this movie, and she has to go back and forth from being a dramatic to a comedic actor within a split second in the same scene without it ever coming across as cartoonish or out of touch with the tone of the scene. And her line delivery was so good, it led to some of the funniest moments, especially when she's asking for a certain someone for help in her investigation, and starts off by cursing them out. And I had to keep myself from howling so that I wouldn't bug the other people in the theater. But her arc was surprisingly also nowhere near as cliched as I thought it was going to be. Without spoiling anything, it involves her making certain discoveries and coming forward to claims where in any other situation the adults would just tell her to fuck off and she would have to do everything herself. But thankfully, the adults involved with the investigation, they don't know where she's getting this information, but they know for a fact that she has it. They know that they need to put a certain amount of faith in her, and she takes that faith responsibly and urgently, which was great to see. And as for the direction of this movie, Scott Derrickson actually did take me by surprise because in his other films, I never really felt like he had a style of his own that made him stand out as a horror filmmaker. With James Wan, you can tell a movie was his. With David F. Sandberg, same thing. Or even with John Krasinski, who was proving himself to be a tremendous horror filmmaker. But with Derrickson, I never really felt like he had his own style. I felt like he was taking and choosing from other films. But thankfully, he really comes into his own with this movie and puts a great deal of emphasis on visual storytelling. He often films inanimate objects that are crucial to a scene, like an empty line of beer bottles or a padlock, in a huge close-up to make it incredibly clear what significance it plays. So the empty line of beer bottles will let us know that Finney and Gwen's dad is an alcoholic. The padlock makes it clear that it's the only way that Finney can supposedly escape. The way that Derrickson films Finney in the basement the entire time is often filmed in a huge wide shot to make the basement feel a lot more open, but still empty and considerably more hopeless. And it adds a lot of great tension and as he's anticipating a phone call to happen. There was one editing technique that I found a little strange at first, but still worked out in the end, where as he's trying to complete a task like trying to dig a hole or climb up a wall, there will be this faded match cut to signify time, even though it's only been a few seconds. And in my opinion, I think that was meant to illustrate how much longer and desperate it feels for him trying to accomplish these tasks. And it was different, but I like seeing different techniques. And when the phone does ring and there's this huge epiphany towards a certain clue, the camera will either zoom in on Finney or it will pan over in a 360 to give the scene a sense of urgency, energy, something dangerous and incredibly shitty is about to happen. Derrickson even brings back the home movie format from Sinister and incorporates them into montages for us to identify with the previous victims in order to flesh them out in a shorter amount of time. There was one kid that Finney didn't necessarily know, but he played baseball against them, and in the home movies, you can see that baseball was a huge bonding element for him and his family. It was something that helped him make friends at school. He really started to care for these kids while still feeling terrified for them. There are a decent amount of jump scares, but it's weirdly enough held back to the point where you can actually count them on your hands, and there was only one that I felt like was a cheap cop-out, and even then, it actually served as an important clue for trying to find an escape or to find a solution. And this is just one of the rare circumstances of a horror movie where the direction, the editing, the performances, the writing, the incredible techno music score by the composer whose name I can't remember. I'm going to put him down in this description here. All of these things work to equally create a scary atmosphere without one ever overshadowing the other. It's surprisingly more subtle and, dare I say, invisible than a lot of horror movies do, and it's really refreshing to see. The only real issue I have with The Black Phone is that the pacing from jumping back and forth from the scenes in the basement, which are downright disturbing, to the scenes of Finn's home life as his father and sister are wondering where he is, what the cops are doing about it. The scenes outside of the basement, they don't often get as fleshed out as I would have liked them to. For the first 20 minutes of the movie, you don't actually really see the grabber. You just see Finn's home life, his relationship with his sister, how they cope with the amount of dangerous shit that they deal with in their lives. And it's enough for us to care and to understand. But there are weird moments, like, say, after 5 minutes of spending time with Finney in the basement, it'll cut to his sister sleeping in school, and everyone just thinks that she's exhausted from all of the stress and goes, "Go to the nurse and take a nap, dear." That scene was like 10 seconds, and then it just cuts back to the basement, and I just sat there and went, what was the point of that? Like, you're going to show us you're going to show what happens, what epiphany that she comes up with. Why would you cut away back to the basement? The editing and the pacing of the scenes outside of the basement, weirdly enough, are a little scatterbrained and underdeveloped, especially in one scene where Gwen does walk up to her father, tells her all of these clues, and he tells her a story about what happened between her mother, how that correlates to all these clues that she's receiving, and how he doesn't want her to blurt these things out loud. And it sounds way too cryptic because it involves a ton of spoilers, and it was a good scene that made me understand why he became such a hard drinker and was so abusive towards his kids. It made him a lot more fleshed out than the abusive dad you see in other movies like this, but it was delivered in such a short amount of time, and I would have liked to have actually seen the story that he was narrating as opposed to hearing it from him because he was such a douchebag before. Don't get me wrong, it made me get a decent amount of sympathy, and you understand that he doesn't actually want to lash out the way that he does, but seeing as how he still does it, and his explanation can be summed up in 5 seconds, it wasn't really enough to make me care for him. And there was this other character who was connected to the grabber and came this close to losing some of the mystique in certain scenes. And on top of that, he was supposed to be kind of a comic relief character too, which I didn't understand. He was too stupid to find funny, and for a horror movie like this where every other character was incredibly smart, seeing him interfere with the overall plot was just weird and pretty unnecessary, seeing as how it doesn't change anything, and you could have edited it out and it would have saved a hell of a lot of time for the pacing. It would have given more time to Gwen conducting her own investigation. It would have went more into the alcoholic father trying to redeem himself. But really, if that's all I've got to complain about, The Black Phone was one of the biggest surprises of the year. It was just as scary as Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. It makes me wonder what would have happened if Derrickson had directed that as opposed to this. But in either case, I'm glad both existed. It totally worked out. The performances were top-notch. The atmosphere was unnerving without having to be too loud and boisterous. It really sneaks up on you. The themes about faith and bravery were commendable. And everything else about it was just... It's really hard for me to describe. It's just such an atmospheric, chilling, and phenomenal thriller. I'm going to give it a 4.5 out of 5. Definitely check it out in theaters if you haven't already. Thank you so much to everybody for watching. If you have seen The Black Phone, let me know in the comments below what you thought of it. Be sure to stay tuned for more reviews, and be sure to like and subscribe. Take care.